I spoke to Gordon Brown at the World Humanitarian Summit here in Istanbul. I began by asking him why his new crisis fund is necessary and if it will work.
It's the first humanitarian fund for education in emergencies. Education of school children falls completely through the net at the moment. Either the money is going in humanitarian aid to food and shelter, or it's going in development aid, which is long-term and can't deal with an emergency. And so there is a gap, and we've got to fill it, because there are 75 million children in the world whose education is being interrupted by conflict or by crises or by earthquake or emergencies. And there are many children who are prevented from going to college or university when they've got the qualifications, and children lose hope. If they cannot go to school, if they cannot plan for the future, if they cannot prepare for the world after school, then we have a desolate generation of young people who are being lost, and we've got to do something about it immediately.
Okay, let me ask you about your home country now, the United Kingdom. There's a big vote coming up. You're clear in your hopes that the UK will stay in Europe. Why should the UK stay in Europe?
Well, I could talk about Brexit and the dangers of it, and I could talk about the more positive arguments that I believe have got to be brought forward about jobs, about security, about dealing with tax havens, about making sure that we have a better environmental and energy policy. And these are the arguments that people should be looking at over the next few weeks. But I am here to talk about education in emergencies, and I want to continue to talk about what we can do on that. There will be other times to debate the future of Europe over the next few weeks, but today I'm here at this humanitarian summit when there is so much need in this region. I want to talk about that.
Okay, but just one final question before we go back to education. You gave a stirring speech during the time of the Scottish Referendum, just on the eve of the referendum. Will we expect you to come out again in all guns blazing in order to get people to stay?
Well, I'm speaking tomorrow in Brussels. I'm doing a lot of rallies and meetings around the United Kingdom over the next few weeks, but we are still there's still a month to go to this referendum. I think most people will start listening more intently to what is being said in the last few days. So at the moment my concentrations are on making sure this new fund for education in emergencies is created, making sure we have the donors around the world who are prepared to contribute. We've said that there are 100 different organizations around the world, businesses, philanthropists, foundations, as well as governments, that are in a position to contribute to this new education kind of weight fund. And over the next few weeks, I'll be approaching all of them and asking them to help.
What's been the most uplifting thing you've heard over the past 24 hours here?
I think it's the stories of young people themselves. You know, my children are at school and they're young, and if someone said you can have a day off school, they'd be quite happy. If someone said you could have a week off school, they'd probably be overjoyed. But young people who are denied schooling for months know the importance of it to them. And when you hear stories of children begging to go to school, saying, why can't I go to school? Saying, I want to learn for the future. I met a kid in Beirut, and I was asking him, as you do, what do you want to do when you grow up? And he said, I want to be an engineer. And I said, why an engineer? Because it's not a terribly popular thing with some of the kids that I talk to. And he said, because I want to rebuild Syria. And it's moving stories like that, particularly of children who have been forced into some of the most impossible situations, some of them forced into child marriage, some of them trafficked, some of them working all hours of the day and never having the chance to get to school. And their pleas, as we've seen at this conference with global youth ambassadors brought here by the World at School, saying, we want to go to school.
Doctors Without Borders, MSF, said this conference was a fig leaf of good intentions. They weren't convinced that anything concrete was going to come out of this. What do you say to them? But
one thing that is concrete has already been announced today, and that is a fund for education in emergencies. The Business Coalition offered 100 million that they would raise for it. Countries have already started. We've opened the appeal, and I think in the last few hours we've got more than 100 million more. And people, when they see that this cause is an essential part of the humanitarian response to emergencies, are prepared to give. So I don't want to comment on what's happening in other areas, because this is the area that I've been deeply involved in, but the Turkish government have convened a conference here under the United Nations auspices that has already got this success, which is the first ever humanitarian fund for education in emergencies. And it's not only novel because it's an education fund, it's a public-private partnership, it's bridging humanitarian aid, which was about food and shelter, with development aid, which can now move into the field of education. And we're offering children who are out of school the chance that even if they're refugees for years on end and displaced from their country, we have an obligation to help them get the education they need. So it is an achievement already of this conference, but of course the challenge and the record of success will be whether we raise the money that's necessary.
Underpinning everything and this education gap and all the other gaps is the politics of it all, the root causes of conflict. And when you keep that in mind, it's great that you're here, former UK Prime Minister. It's great to see Angela Merkel here, the Secretary General here, President Erdogan's here. However, are you disappointed that Vladimir Putin's not here, Sergei Lavrov, President Obama, John Kerry? Are you disappointed that they didn't get involved?
Well, I think each country's made its own decision about how much it is going to do and announce at this conference. President Obama, for example, has called a special conference on refugees in September, so presumably his efforts and his funding announcements will come at that conference in September. So each country has a different view as to when it's going to do something. The question is whether together as an international community we're doing enough. And the answer is no, we are not doing enough. We have got to do more.
Root causes again, how do we solve Syria?
You know, if I was part of the negotiators, I would tell you that unless we can get some negotiated settlement, then every peace agreement will be fragile. So we need a settlement that is long-term, that is sustainable, that involves all the parties, and that is really something that I know John Kerry, but all the other negotiators are working towards, and I can't contribute any expertise because I'm not on the inside of these discussions. What I do know, however, is that whatever happens, the need to rebuild Syria is going to be obvious, that reconstruction in the region is going to be necessary, that the future of young people has been imperiled by the very fact of a civil war, and we've got to prepare for that future. And so side by side with the peace process, we need to be thinking of reconstruction, and we do need that Marshall Plan for the region, and I believe it extends to North Africa as well as to the Middle East.
You say extends to North Africa. Everything seems to be inextricably intertwined in this globalized world. As a European, how do you feel about the fact that a far-right leader came one sliver away from being elected president in Austria?
You see, on the one hand, we've got globalization, which opens up the world and creates a need to cooperate. On the other hand, you can see the populist reaction, which is as people see a world economy or a world that looks like a runaway train and out of control, it awakens in them, or reawakens in some cases, a need to belong. And so side by side with the need to integrate the world economy because it's interconnected, you also see this demand to bring control back home. And you're seeing it all across Europe, you're seeing it even in America with the candidatures for the presidency. You see this popular and protectionist reaction to globalization. And so globalization needs a human face. We need to show that we can manage globalization in the well rather than badly. People feel power is everywhere where they're not at the moment, and they need to have a sense that we're going to manage it for the best interests of them and their families and their communities in the future. So what comes out of the protests, the isolationism in some cases, the anger against refugees in other places, the desire to close your borders in other places, protectionist attitudes on trade elsewhere, is we need to recognize that with the advantages we have from globalization and the opening up of markets and opportunities and the global sourcing of goods and services, which makes goods cheapest to people, we also have this desperate need that people feel that they bring events under control, and in some cases a demand that is unrealistic, of course, to bring control back home, because we've got to cooperate in an ever more independent world. So it's up to the world leaders to answer these questions by showing that we can manage globalization better.
And tying that back to the education fund, those voters for populist demagogues, if you like, whether it's Donald Trump or European nationalist politicians, will say, why are you spending billions of dollars on refugees in a far-off place in conflicts that have nothing to do with us. We need to look after our own. Why, Gordon Brown? Why?
If Austrians look at it, then if they want to slow down the pressures of migration from the Middle East or from North Africa, then the best way they can do it is giving young people the opportunity to get an education in the country or in the region in which they live. So even if it was simply self-serving to slow down the waves of migration, there's a huge case for investing in education for young people to stay in Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey. But of course there is another reason, that young people who become frustrated and discontented become exploited by terrorist groups and can turn to extremism.
I know your schedule's very tight, so it would be remiss of me not to ask you about your beloved Labour Party, if you'll allow me, before you go.
I think I've answered questions on everything, but I'm really going to talk about education in emergencies
If
today.
you don't mind, as the final question.
You can ask me, but I'm not going to answer.
Are you worried about the future of the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn? Accusations of anti-Semitism. Things are not well within the Labour Party. Are you worried?
Anti-Semitism has no place in any political party, in any community and in any country. And I think the election of Sadiq Khan as Mayor of London showed that the people of London and who voted Labour will not be divided on the issue of race, will not be divided on the issues of religion, will not allow sectarianism or prejudice or discrimination ever to dominate the thinking of people when they come to voting, but also the way they relate to other people. And the Jewish community have got a very strong and welcome presence in London and in the whole of the United Kingdom.
So it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.